Hello. In this presentation, I am going to talk about some important notions when we are characterizing oral language. To do so, I will refer to 5 main notions that help us describe language and explain distinctions between oral and written language. The first concept that I will mention is the notion of utterance. Secondly, I will compare and contrast what we understand by written and spoken language as conceptualized by the authors cited in the bibliography of the course. After that, I will explain the concepts of medium and mode in relation to language descriptions. Then, I will derive a definition of text in contrast to the definition of discourse, and I will end this presentation by describing discourse analysis as a field in the study of language. As I develop these different but interrelated concepts, I will help you reflect on them through tasks that are intended for you to develop a mental mind map of the ways in which these concepts relate and how they are realized in language use situations in the real world. Let me start with the first concept that is of crucial importance for us to understand language as characterized in the course. It is the notion of utterance. What is an utterance? According to Bakhtin, an utterance is a unit of speech communication which boundaries are determined by a change of speaking subject. That is to say, it is not a conversational unit, but a real one, which starts and ends with language produced by one person at one point in interaction. For example, in the case of written language, an utterance can be a whole piece of writing, such as an email, while in the case of oral language, it is the language produced by a speaker at any point in interaction, whether it be a back channeling item such as or an extended term as the one that I am developing right now through this presentation. So, it is possible to conclude, then, that to learn to speak means to learn to construct utterances, because we speak in utterances and not in individual sentences or words. If you think, for example, of a conversation between two people, it will be made up of various utterances chained one after the other. But probably, this chaining will not be shaped at random, since all utterances have definite and relatively stable typical forms of construction of the whole. These typical forms of construction that we learn as we learn to speak will facilitate interaction, since participants will be engaged in the task of interaction with a shared background in terms of the ways these utterances are generated in speech. Let us watch an extract of the film The Green Book, which is intended to illustrate our discussion of the notion of utterance so far. As you watch, try answering these questions. How would you describe the utterances produced by Tony, the white driver, and Dr. Shirley, the colored pianist? In what ways does the discussion on the content of the love letter that is being written down by Tony relate to the expected forms of construction of language for that utterance?
Dear Dolores, D-E-A-R, this is an animal. As I'm writing this letter, I'm eating potato chips, and I'm starting to get thirsty. And you know this is pathetic, right? Tell me what you're trying to say.
Oh. Yeah, I miss her.
Then say that. But do it in a manner that no one else has ever done it before. something like, put this down. Falling in love with you was the easiest thing I've ever done.
Nothing matters to me but you. And every day I'm alive, I'm aware of this. I loved you the day I met you. I love you today, and I will love you the rest of my life. So can I put P.S. Kiss the Kids?
A P.S.
Yeah, like at the end.
That's like clanging a cowbell at the end of Shostakovich's The Seventh.
Right. So that's good.
It's perfect, Tony.
As you must have noticed, the scene is very interesting for our analysis in two distinct ways. On one hand, the utterances of the characters show their social and educational backgrounds, among other aspects, strongly marked in their speech. What I mean to say is that they illustrate what Bakhtin means when he says that language enters into life through concrete utterances, which manifest language, and that life enters language through concrete utterances as well. In this particular example, the way in which life is being manifested in the love letter through specific linguistic choices transforms somehow the effect on the interlocutor being addressed by the letter. Also note that the whole conversation is changing both characters. Tony is explicitly being educated by Dr. Shirley through the conversation. In turn, Dr. Shirley is being introduced into the life and habits of a working family in New York at the time of the story. So it is possible to conclude that life is embedded in utterances, and language, through concrete utterances, fills in life with energy. On the other hand, the conversation is a good example of the fact that we speak in definite speech genres. In other words, we cast our speech in definite generic forms, sometimes rigid and trite ones, sometimes more flexible, plastic and creative ones. So, what is a speech genre under this light? A speech genre is not a form of language, but a typical form of utterance. Although we will define the notion of genre further in the course of the next lessons, we can anticipate that genres correspond to typical situations of speech communication, typical themes. We can also say that speech genres organize our speech and will structure it in expected ways shared with other members of the discourse community. Now that we have defined the notion of utterance, let's pass on to the main four differences between written and spoken language. Let me start by saying that it is generally agreed in the academic world that there is no one simple distinction between written and spoken language. Yet, linguists keep working and examining both written and spoken language to achieve as detailed descriptions as possible for two main reasons. The first one is that we need descriptions to be as accurate as possible of both written and spoken language for study and research purposes. Linguists need to be able to depart from precise descriptions of language to be able to build on further knowledge for professional reasons. The second reason is that we need accurate descriptions to be able to teach the language. This pedagogic intention has somehow influenced many of the linguists that we read in this course and is a main motivation for us educators. So let's pass on to this no simple description of the difference between written and spoken language. Mike McCarthy says that the most useful way To conceive of the differences between written and spoken language is perhaps to see them as scales along which individual texts can be plotted. So we can say that a certain text tends to be more writerly or more speakerly. The word tend is key here. We will describe texts in scales considering their tendencies. But what are those levels of analysis that we need to consider? The first one is that speech tends to be more involved, while writing tends to be more detached. By this we mean that in speech, interlocutors are interpersonally more involved, while in writing, authors tend to distance themselves from their interlocutors and be more detached. Two extreme examples can be, on the one hand, a casual conversation with a friend, as an example of this involvement that is conceived of as typical of the spoken language. In contrast, an academic paper in written language is an exponent of the detachment that is expected in written language. Yet, when we analyze real-world examples of language, such as this presentation that I am developing, such black and white distinction blurs. This presentation belongs to the spoken language, but sounds highly detached. So we can say that at this level of analysis, an academic oral presentation tends to be detached. The second aspect to consider is that oral language tends to be more implicit, while written language holds a tendency towards explicitness. The reason for this is that as oral language occurs in real time, speakers have the chance to make adjustments and introduce clarifications to their contributions as interaction progresses, considering the ongoing feedback they receive from their interlocutors. In contrast, there is no such possibility in written language. A text will be read in elapsed time and therefore requires a higher level of detail so as to be understood. This leads us to the third distinction in these scales, that spoken language occurs in real time, while written language is created at one time and read in elapsed time. This difference between the moment in which language is produced and received by the interlocutor is responsible for the degree of detail and explicitness that is required for most written language, in contrast to the implicitness that we can tolerate in oral language. Yet, many extended genres today, such as WhatsApp texting, contain a high level of implicitness and real-time use. Most people have found themselves interacting in a written chat as if it was an oral exchange among us. So, we can say that most WhatsApp texts tend to be implicit and real-time. The last aspect to consider in this distinction between written and spoken language is that spoken language tends to be fragmented because of its real-time nature. As it is produced in real time, it tends to be less elaborate and simpler in linguistic choices. In contrast, written language displays more elaborate organization and a variety of linguistic choices. However, this distinction has to be analyzed in the light of specific examples. Let us analyze an example of an interaction among the two characters in the film The Green Book to see how these concepts can be used when analyzing specific exponents of language use. As you watch, try to describe the use of language in conversation that each of the characters develops. Use McCarthy's scales to guide your analysis.